morning, KINGSWAY Church. It is great to be together with everyone again, and happy Sunday. Today we are beginning our deep dive into the amazing book of Esther. We are looking at chapter 1, which, although it doesn't even mention our heroine Esther, it does set the stage for her entrance next time in chapter 2. What God is showing us in this chapter is that He is always at work, and He can even use the pride and prejudices in others to bring His plans to pass.
Hi y'all, Kingsway Church has some big news. We're moving. Kingsway Church is moving to Royce City, Texas in the fall of 2024. As for the time being, we will temporarily be meeting in Midlothian, Texas over the summer. For directions, please email info@kingswaychurch.life. More details coming soon. Come join us.
Hi, if you have a prayer request, Kingsway Church would love to pray with you. Just email info@kingswaychurch.life or visit the church website at kingswaychurch.life and click the prayer request button on the homepage. Prayer warriors are standing by to partner with you in prayer.
Kairos is here. If you would like to learn about how to identify and break down the barriers that hinder you from a more intimate relationship with God, come join Kingsway at the Gateway campus as we pursue freedom with the Lord. This is a one-day event with 3 dates to choose from: July 11th, July 25th, and July 26th. Please note that childcare will not be provided. If you are interested, email info@kingswaychurch.life for more information. Freedom is possible. Hope to see you there.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad you're here. Now let's worship Jesus.
Well, hello, Kingsway Church. Happy Sunday. It is so awesome to have all our family here today. Well, not all of it, but a very large portion of it. And we are so glad to gather in this place. And certainly the word that came for us today was our place of peace. This is our house where the Lord dwells, and He brings His peace. Just like the word that came earlier, God is our peace, and we breathe Him in. We sang earlier that in God's majesty we find His peace. Now, one of the things in life that can rob us of our peace so quickly is oftentimes the sins of others, and we're going to see that play out today in the book of Esther, chapter 1. But even though she's not even mentioned in this chapter, we were looking at how the sins of other people end up affecting our lives. In this case, we were specifically looking at the sins of pride and of prejudice. But more importantly, what we're really looking at and what we're really studying is God's sovereign hand, which is always at work, even when we don't see it. Again, just like we sang today, even when I can't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. And that is so true. Well, let's jump in, but first, let's pray. Father God, we thank You so much for this time in Your Word. We love You so much, Lord. We welcome You here. We commit ourselves. We anoint this time. We set it aside so that we can hear from You and learn from You and become closer to You, so that everything we do and say brings You honor and glory in Jesus' name. All right, so let's start off with our reading summary of chapter 1. Now, for those of you that weren't here last time, we did the overview of the book of Esther. Now, the book of Esther is a great and wonderful story. It really plays out like a play. So you have the first act where everything is being set up. You have the second act, which is the satanic plot is revealed, and it seems like the enemy has all the cards and he's going to win. But then in the third act, we have this providential plot twist when God comes in and not only saves the day, but He exposes the evil, and God is glorified. So we are in then Act 1, and we are in Act 1. The setup will take the first 2 chapters. So we're in chapter 1, and let's take a look at our summary and see what will happen there. The chapter 1 today pretty much has two divisions. We have the pride of the king and the queen, which will take us from verses 1 through 12. And then we have the prejudice of his advisors, of the king's advisors, which we'll see in verses 13 through 22. Now, to make all this make sense, we do have to do a fair amount of background, because this is in the Old Testament, and some of the customs and the story, we're really jumping into the middle of a story, and you really got to understand the prequel to understand where we are. So where we are with the Jews in the whole story of God is they are currently in exile. So the Jewish people are in the world's biggest timeout. So they are in exile, they're in foreign countries, and it lasts for 70 years, for 7 decades. So we need to learn, how did they get here? So what has happened is this is God's judgment on the nation of Israel for centuries, literally centuries of disobedience. So this actually starts way back in 930 BC when the kingdom of God is divided. Now officially it was divided because of overtaxing from Solomon's son Rehoboam. However, the real reason was it all started with Solomon's idolatry with his foreign wives. And so we have this split. They were once unified under God. God makes glorious promises, but they for whatever reason, Solomon just can't hold on to it. And so as punishment, the kingdom split. So the 10 tribes in the north go off and they become the nation of Israel. The 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, become the southern kingdom. Now, over the next 200 years, Israel has 19 kings, and not one of them is faithful to God. Now, despite prophet after prophet giving warning after warning, they continue in their sin, and they consciously break God's law and continuously fall into idol worship. And so they reach a point where God just has to say, because He is a God of justice, enough is enough. And then, despite not learning from their cousins to the north, Israel then, so as a result of their punishment, Israel falls to Assyria in 720 BC, and they're taken beyond the Euphrates rivers, which is now Syria and Iraq. So they are taken like 900 miles away, and that's where their punishment goes. Now, their cousins to the south, the nation of Judah, doesn't learn from Israel's mistakes, because it takes them then 320 years from the division of Solomon's kingdom for them to fall. Now, they have 20-some kings, and 7 of them do stay true to God, but still the majority of them don't. And again, despite prophet after prophet giving warning after warning, they continue to sin and consciously break God's law and consciously fall into idol worship. Do we see the pattern here? So then in 608, Judah falls to the nation of Babylon. Solomon's amazing temple, one of the 7 wonders of the world, is destroyed, and the people are then taken to Mesopotamia. Now, interesting little trivia: this is where the term Jews is actually born, because they are the tribe of Judah. They start off as the Judahites, but that doesn't really flow off the tongue very well. So at some point in their 70 years, they become known as the Jews, and it just sticks, and it's been that way ever since. Now, so what we're looking at here is the pride of the Jews forced God's hand of judgment to send them into exile. And while they're in exile, they experience a massive amount of prejudice on a massive, massive scale. And they're going to see that prejudice then play out throughout the world, and it's still in place today. Now, those who stayed behind, however, back in Samaria, will ultimately become the Samaritans, who are further part of the consequences of disobeying God's, and they will be a thorn in Israel's side for generations to come. Now, if our story ended just right here, it would seem, well, God backed the wrong horse. These guys can't do it, but that is not the case. So we remember, but remember, none of this is really about the Jews. We see what happened to the Jews as a result of their disobedience. What this story is really about is about God and His mighty hand and His sovereign control over the affairs of men. Now, it's also about God being faithful to keep His promises and to protect His name's sake. So let's look at that element of God's sovereign control. This is the first thing that we see. So while he is, and this is the amazing part about God, while he is in the process of disciplining his children, he is also multitasking to protect them and guide all of human history for his own purposes. But let me be very clear on this point. God never, ever causes anyone to sin. He has given us all free will, and we will always have the choice to follow him or not. But he also knows every one of us, and he knows how we will respond. He is all-knowing, he is all-present, he is all-powerful. Paul tells us something in the New Testament, but since it's about God's character, and we know that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, it's still true about God in the Old Testament. In Romans 8:28, he says, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. So while he is protecting his disobedient children, he is still humbling the kings in these mighty pagan empires. So as the exile occurs, it occurs during 4 books in the Bible. It occurs during Daniel, Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. And it tracks all of those in the southern tribes who are now known as Jews and will be forever on. Now, during this time, there are 5 kings between the fall of Judah and the edict that will allow them to return to Jerusalem in 538 BC. So it is also interesting to note that while only 7 of the 42 Jewish kings that existed from Solomon to the exile, while only 7 of them acknowledged God and followed his precepts, which, by the way, that's only a 16% passing rate, 4 out of 5 of the pagan Gentile kings acknowledged God. That's an 80% passing rate. You see the disparity that God is working with here, but the key is he's still working with it. And some amazing things happen when God is at work in those pagan rulers. So let's look at how his sovereign plans chart the course of the world. So the first pagan king that God has, that he works through is Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel 2, he has the dream of the statue. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has a lot of dreams, and they're super fascinating, but we got to hold that for another time. Specifically, we're looking at the statue because the statue gives us an indication of how God has already planned out human history, and he tells Nebuchadnezzar through his dream, which is interpreted by the prophet Daniel, to let him know what God's plan actually is. So in the statue, we start with the head of gold. This is the Babylonians. And then it moves down to the chest of silver, which is the Medo-Persians, the next empire that's going to rise and rule the world. The stomach is made of brass, and that's going to be the Greek Empire, which, when we get into Esther, is looming in the background and coming shortly. On the statue, we have the legs of iron. That's the Empire of Rome that will take over from Greece. And then the feet are made of iron and clay, and that is the modern states and powers that we are in right now. They're made of clay and iron because there's strength and there's clay that is soft, but clay, remember, once it's broken, can be remolded, and that's the key of where the modern times go, is that there's good, there's bad, it's all mixed together, but God can still work with it. But the most important part is that a rock, not hewn by human hands, crashes into the feet, and it becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. In Daniel 2:46 and 47, King Nebuchadnezzar, remember, this is the pagan king that was ruling the known world at the time. He falls on his face, prostrate before the prophet Daniel, and he says, "Truly, your God is God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets." If only the Jews could have grasped that 70 years ago, they'd have been so much better off. So we go from Nebuchadnezzar to his son Belshazzar, and this is where we get the handwriting on the wall in Daniel 5. And he writes out essentially in code that only Daniel is able to interpret, that Belshazzar has been measured and weighed and found wanting, and he is then the last king of the Babylonian Empire as the Medes and Persians come in that very night and wipe out the Persians and take over. So now we move on to the next group of kings, which it starts with Darius, who's sometimes called Darius the Mede. There's 3 Dariuses, which makes it confusing. But Darius is the one where we get the story of the lion's den. Now this is still Daniel at work here. He's getting really old when this happens. But in Daniel 6:26, Darius, again, a pagan king, makes a decree after Daniel survives the lion's den, that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. This guy, this pagan king, is actually prophesying what God is going to do. He is prophesying God's divine guiding hand over human events. The next king we come to is Cyrus. Cyrus is important because he's the one that allows the exiles to return. Now, I wish we had time, and in fact, I'm going to make this your homework. Your homework is to go and read Isaiah 45, because this is a specific prophecy about King Cyrus. He is named by name 160 years before before he reads it. So, and what he is told is, he is told specifically that he's going to conquer Babylon. He's going to free the exiles. He's going to rebuild the temple. All the things that were going to happen 160 years prior. That would be like a president in the United States today being told specifically by name during the Civil War. That's how long ago it happened. And so Cyrus then takes his place as God's, and in fact in Isaiah 45 it said he is specifically the anointed one. He is set aside for this purpose. And so he takes his purpose, he sends the exiles and does amazing things. But we got to put him aside because we got other stuff to get to. The next king we come to is Darius the First. Now he's important because he's the one that finally sees the temple completed. We see this in Ezra 6. In Ezra 6, he makes a decree through the decree of Darius says that the new temple, the second temple, will be paid for completely out of the Persian royal treasury, and every item from the temple, all the gold, all the silver, all the elements for the temple that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar have been stored and tracked, and they are now being returned to the new temple. And he instructs the local Persian governors to help and to not interfere. And he says he is going to in his decree, in his royal decree, he said that they are to build the house of God. And remember, this is important because it's not the house of a God, which most foreign nations, believed in many gods. But here Darius is saying specifically it's the house of God. He also says that so that they, meaning the Jews, may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven, and to pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. And he also includes the punishment of death of anyone that interferes with this edict or interferes with the building or of God's temple. Next, we come to King Ahasuerus. This is where we are in King Esther. Now, Ahasuerus is the name they refer to him in Hebrew, but his Greek name, most everybody's familiar with, is King Xerxes. And he's important because he institutes the Feast of Purim. Now, Purim is still celebrated by the Jews today. Now, and after him, then 5 kings, and 130 years later, his great-great-great-great-great-grandson is going to end up being the last of the Persian kings, who loses the battle of Isius to the young Greek upstart who's named Alexander. So this begins then the Greek Empire, which was that third section of the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. This is the stomach of brass. Now, the Greeks are important because their extensive road system and their common language would set the stage for the legs of iron, for the next, the Roman Empire, to take their place in God's story, and all those elements are built on by Rome so that the gospel can spread quickly and easily and efficiently. Now, this is not just a vision that happened to just, some guy thousands of years ago. Do you realize that we, right here in this room, in this church, we are in that vision that is happening right now? Because Christ is the rock not hewn with human hands, that breaks the legs of the statue and covers the earth. He's in the process of covering the earth right now. And that rock is Christ, the rock of ages. He is the stumbling block. He is the spiritual rock. He is the crushing stone. He is the chief cornerstone. And he's filling the world right now. And we who are in him are part of that vision. And just like Cyrus, we were prophesied thousands of years ago. So God's sovereign hand has been clearly guiding human affairs in the nations of the world, but he also looks at us individually. So let's take a look at how God sovereignly allowed a bunch of pride and prejudice in others to clear space for a young Hebrew girl named Esther to come into the kingdom for such a time as this. All right, let's look at our first section in the text. This is the pride of the king and queen. It'll be chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. So let's read through it. Chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Verse 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. We'll come back to that. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from the great to the small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white linens and curtains fastened with cords of linen and purple and silver rods and marble pillars, and on the couches were gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, of white and black marble. They served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance. That's important. We'll come back to that one later too. According to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. That's another part that's important we'll come back to. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Now on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded a bunch of guys that I'm not even going to try pronouncing because I'm sure I will butcher it. These were 7 of his eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, and they were to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. All right, so as we look at this, we have essentially two parties or feasts or festivals that are listed here. The first one, yes, you heard it right, lasted for 6 months, and the second one lasted for a week. Now the first one, the one that was 180 days, this was for all of his officials and servants. These are the powers of Persia and Media. So this involves a lot of people for a very long time. So let's take a look at this map that shows his kingdom. Now again, remember, this is made up of 127 provinces, and his kingdom went from today, which is southern Turkey, right on the top of the Mediterranean there, down through Syria, Jordan, Israel, and just the very corner of Egypt, and then out to the east, where we get to modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, and just kind of the very edge of Iran on the other side of the Euphrates there. So it's almost 200,000 square miles. It's massive. His 127 provinces were ruled by men called satraps, which were essentially governors or rulers. And for each one, he had officials, plural, and servants, plural. So let's just, for argument's sake, say that there was 10 people from each province, which probably was a whole lot more. That would give us 1,260 people to be housed, fed, and entertained for 6 months. And we think we have problems with government spending. That took a huge chunk, I'm sure. Now, and even beyond that, when these days were completed, then we start the next party, a 7-day feast. And this is for those who are present in the city of Shushan, great and small. So essentially, this is most scholars think this was like a thank you party. So I entertained everybody from all over the kingdom, but you people that made it happen here, let's party for another 7 days. Now, most scholars think that all of this, the 6 months and the week-long feasts, were really a pitch meeting, essentially, to get support to go to war with Greece. In verse 4, he shows the riches of his glorious kingdom and his excellent majesty. Now, here's a little background on that. Now, Xerxes' father Darius had actually tried to invade Greece in the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, but they were beaten soundly by the Athenians, even though the Persians outnumbered them 2-1. A little bit of useless side trivia. This is where our race today, called a marathon, comes from. It honors the Greek messenger who ran over 25 miles to deliver the victory back to Athens, and then died once he delivered it. So fortunately, the marathons we run today, you don't have to die at the end of it, because that would be a bummer. But they'd save money on t-shirts because you wouldn't need one, I guess. But anyway, so Xerxes is now on the throne, and he's ready to take his shot at Greece. So he leads the second Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC, about 10 years later, which is about the same time that the book of Esther begins. And so most scholars think that these feasts were really to gather support for that. And so he goes out and he fights the Greek in a narrow pass called Thermopylae. Now there, about 50,000 Greek forces held off the Persian army of about 300,000 men for 3 straight days, but ultimately lost. Now, more useless side trivia, Leonidas and the 300 Spartans were not the only ones fighting the Persians. They were just part of the rear guard of about 1,400 men that were there to hold off the Persians so that the rest of the army could fall back and regroup. But you talk about the power of recycling your own version. Once that was over, then the Spartans used that for, we're so awesome, our 300 guys held off the Persians. They left off the other part about the other 1,000 or so people that helped them, but we'll leave that off to the side. So they get all the credit, and so that's what people remember. But anyway, but the Persians essentially barreled on through them. They worked their way around, burning and pillaging the cities. They finally make it all the way down to Athens, capture it, burn it to the ground. They leave it for one of the generals to finish, but ultimately he ends up losing it as the Greeks regroup under the leadership of the new ruler Alexander, and then the tides change completely. But that's another thing. So getting back to our text then, let's look at how the pride of the king is going to affect Esther. So like we said, she's not even mentioned here, but all this is the setup to get her into place. And so we see how God's sovereign hand is moving through the goofiness of people to make his plans come to pass. So at the end of the second feast, or this pitch meeting for the war with Greece, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, he's feeling pretty good about himself. He spent 6 months and a week bragging about everything he has and how awesome he has. So he calls out for Queen Vashti to come and appear before everyone and to show off how beautiful his wife is. Now remember that this group involves the great and the small, the important somebodies and the insignificant nobodies. And you'll see why that's important here in just a second. So his pride has just caught up with him, and he has done something that as a king, technically he was allowed to do, but as a husband, he has just set about showing off his wife as a trophy, which any man who's been married for more than 10 minutes knows that this will not end well, and it doesn't. So ultimately the king's pride then is now about to bump up against the queen's pride. So in today's vernacular, we would say it's about to get real up in here. So now let's look at the queen's pride, because that's a factor of it too. Also remember that there were a lot of things that were not told in the book of Esther. So we're not told specifically what God's plans are. In fact, God by name or anything is not even mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. The author leaves it to us to figure out what God's plans are based on what happens. We're also not specifically told why Queen Vashti refuses to respond to the king's summon. There are some clues that can help us try to figure it out. So, for example, in verse 9, we're told that the queen made a feast for just the women, separate from the men. Now, this, though, was not uncommon for the time that men and women would feast separate from each other. Now, some scholars have conjectured that she may have refused for fear of her safety. So she would have been the only woman that this group of men has seen for 7 days. And remember, there was a lot of wine going around, so it may not have been safe for her. Other scholars theorize that she just refused to appear because of her station in life, who she was. Now, we do know from the Jewish Midrash, which is a body of ancient rabbinic literature, that she was the great-granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar and the daughter of King Belshazzar. It also holds that she was captured by King Darius. Remember when they conquered Babylon, she was captured, but because of her beauty, she was given to Xerxes or Ahasuerus to marry because she was so beautiful, just like we're told here in verse 11. So she is from royal blood, she was raised in the royal courts, and she married into royalty. So when King Xerxes or Ahasuerus wants to parade her before the lower classes of the city, she might have felt that, I'm just above that, I'm too good for that. But even though we don't exactly know why, what we do know is that she refused the summons. So she's refusing this summons of the king really to be shown off like property, like a new car or a Rolex or something. So her pride then catches up with her as she did something that as a wife and a self-respecting person she should be able to do, but refusing the king was also something that as the queen of the Persian Empire she was not able to do. So even with the pride then of the king and queen, they were not the only people at play that God is using to make room for Esther in this cast of characters. So now we come to the second half of this chapter, and let's see what happens there. So in the second section, this is the pride of the advisors. So this will be verses 13 through 22. So let's start in verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being a bunch of other people whose Persian names I can't pronounce, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and who were ranked highest in his kingdom. Verse 15, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? Verse 16, then Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but she has also all the princes and all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when the report King Ahasuerus' command to Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all the empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. Verse 21, and the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And he sent letters to the king's provinces, in each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master of his own house and speak in the language of his own people. So, what we have here in this section, we see that the king is just going along with what somebody else says, and as a result, this then gives us a window into the prejudices of his advisors. Now, to me, it reads like Memucan is really having some issues at home, and he's using the king's scenario to deal with it. It's kind of like when somebody says, I have a friend that's having a hypothetical problem, just happens to be the same thing I'm going through. Because when I read it, it sounds like he is clearly working through some issues at home. But the king and all the princes, because remember, this is their 7th day of being pickled, and with all the wine that's been going around. And so the proclamation is highly prejudiced against women in that, number one, it assumes that the women are not already honoring their husbands, which is likely not true. Number two, it assumes that all the women in the whole kingdom, or at least according to verse 18, the noble women will rebel, and suddenly there will be excessive contempt and wrath. I mean, I don't know about you, but this just sounds like something's going on that we would say, that someone would say after 7 days of straight drinking. The level of application doesn't seem realistic to me anyway. But regardless of the reason, the proclamation is made, and the queen is essentially fired. In verse 19, it specifically says that Vashti should not see the king anymore, and her position should be given to someone who is better. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. We don't know if she's banished. We don't know if she's beheaded. We just know that she can't see him, and her position's going to somebody else. Because for our purposes, and more importantly for God's purposes, that's all we need to know. So what can we learn from all this craziness? So how do we deal with people who judge us before they even know anything about us? Or how do we deal with people whose pride creates bad situations over and over? Well, the short answer really is to have faith and let God defend you. Because remember that faith is the evidence of things unseen. So when you can't see the answer or the way out, you may have to stir this up within yourself and resist the urge to do something rash that's motivated by your flesh rather than led by the Holy Spirit. Now, I will certainly be the first to say that this is easier said than done, but it does not mean that that still isn't true. Because when we can't see him or understand his ways, when it seems like the enemy is winning, when it's hard to remember that God is still in control. In my own life, I've seen pretty much 3 things that have helped me get back on track with the Lord. So the first thing that always helps me is to remember his deeds. This would be your testimony. What are the verbs? What has God done in your life? How has he orchestrated, or what obstacle has he removed for you? So for example, during the time after leaving Egypt, the Jews would sometimes keep a stone or a rock from a place where God did something miraculous. Specifically, when they crossed the River Jordan, when they're crossing over, the specific instructions were for one man from each tribe to take a stone out of the center of the Jordan River and create a stone of remembrance. That way future generations would ask, what's the meaning of this rock? And the Israelites would then have an opportunity to share their testimony and hopefully increase the faith of those that were asking. Remember, at the end of time in the book of Revelation, it says that the saints make war with the dragon with the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, because these are the 2 things that the enemy has no power over. He cannot fight the blood of the Lamb in your life, the covering of God's mercy, and he also cannot come against your testimony, because that is real. You've experienced it and you've seen it with your own eyes. No lies he makes up can change that from being true. Secondly, in my life, it often helps for me to remember his words. So what has God actually told you? And so these words then will generally fall into 2 categories. So we always start with the logos, with the written word, because the enemy's constant trick and the way he always tries to get us came from the beginning of time, and he uses it because it works. Has God really said? Well, this is where you go to the Word, and the Word gives you instructions. It may not be specific to your situation, like there's no verse on road rage, but you can apply things in it. So when you're in a situation and you want to get back at somebody, you can turn to, let's say, Romans 12:19. And it tells the beloved, and God tells the beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So we have the logos, the written word. We also have the rhema, which is his spoken word. And this is something that is personal just between you and him. So these would be dreams that God gives you, or visions that he gives you, or words of knowledge, wisdom, words of exhortation, and so on. These are when he speaks specifically in your life. And the third and most important thing, at least for me anyway, is always to remember his character. Who has God been to you? This is always, in my life anyway, one of the first things the enemy will try to attack. And I mean, look how organized God is. This was laid out in the song we sang today. Who has he been? He is the way maker. He's the miracle worker. He's the promise keeper. He's the light in the darkness. He's my God. That is who he is. We all sing that song. We all know those words. There's 5 things right there if you ever get lost in his character, because that's true in all of our lives all the time. So with all this craziness and drama in the Persian court due to various issues of pride and prejudice, with all that happening, the bottom line is that God, in his sovereign hand, has just made room for Esther to step right in and become the most powerful woman in the Persian Empire, which we will get to next time. All right, so let's close this out like we do every week. We'll give God some time to speak into our lives. And we always ask the question, what's God saying to you in this today? Is there something that you need to remember about what God has done for you? Is there something in your testimony that God is needing to stir up to remind you of his faithfulness? Is there something in his word? Has God dropped a verse into your heart right now? Is there something that he's been, something from his word that you're ruminating on right now? Is there something about his character? Anything that we've sang about, or anything that describes who he has been in your life? Is God wanting to remind you of some of those things to get you through a tough time? Let's take a few moments and give God some time to speak.